Hello and welcome to Getting More Out of VMware. I am John Diaz, a Senior Technical Marketing Architect with the Cloud Management BU at VMware. And today we're going to talk about supercharging vRealize operations with Webhook shims and the REST API. We got a lot to cover today, so let's get started on the agenda. We're first just going to cover why you would even want to do this, why extend vROps. Then we'll go through three different ways that you can extend. One would be through programmatic access using the REST API with vROps. We'll also introduce the PowerShell module for vROps and show you some of the things that you can do there. And then finally, we'll wrap up with Webhook shims, which are a way to extend alert notifications out to third-party products such as service desk, paging systems, even vRealize orchestrators. So a lot of good content here today. And as I mentioned, we'll get started with why extending vROps. Why are we even having this conversation? And I think the examples that I have here are some pretty common use cases that I've seen from customers, or I've talked to SEs who have had customers ask for these kinds of things. And basically, it's great to have a nice, rich UI that you can log into and interact with and get a lot of information. But sometimes it just comes down to being able to get information through some third-party application or to some third-party application, other IT tooling, like I mentioned, Service Desk. Chat ops is a big thing now, and people want to be able to have notifications sent to things like Slack or other communication systems. So those are all important, as well as being able to take that those alerts and maybe do some automated remediation with them. And let's not forget about DevOps. vROps, big part of DevOps by virtue of being an operational management platform. So I don't think it's a coincidence that these two can really work together. And what I'm going to show you today allows developers to be able to take advantage of some of the capabilities or all the capabilities of vROps as part of their development process. All right, let's dig in with the REST API. That's kind of the first piece of our approach or our capability for extending vROps or supercharging vROps, as I like to call it. And just so you'll know, the documentation for the REST API for vROps is not found on our website under pubs like you would normally think. It's actually conveniently located on the appliance as you deploy it. So it's a web page that you go to. You see the links there. You can actually just go to vROps/suite-API and it'll get you to a welcome page, and then you can get into it from there. But there are kind of two faces to the APIs. There's a public API, which is the officially supported APIs. Those are the APIs that you can leverage for your environment. They can include pretty much everything you can imagine, from managing alerts, adapters, resources, reports, users, just practically anything that you could do within the user interface, the graphical user interface. There are also internal APIs, and these are available for use, but they're not officially supported because they may change at some point. So we may decide to change these or deprecate them. Sometimes they'll be moved into the public API. But use these with caution. There are some good things in there, like modifying and modifying custom groups, for example, is one. And just be aware that if you do use those, there's a specific header requirement for those. So just be aware, and I have it documented right there on the bottom part of the screen under that documentation. The other part of the documentation that's really important is model representations, and this gives you a listing or a catalog of the properties for requests and responses that you'll make to and get from the API. So there are a lot of little parameters that could be used as part of a request, and there are responses that you'll get back. And so it's important to understand what these are referring to, what these labels are referring to. So you see here, for an example of an alert, and it's made up of all these different properties. And so we explain what those properties are, and you can't really see it on the screen, but it also talks in there about, what kind of value is it? Is it a string? Is it an integer? Is it a date format, etc.? So Very important piece of the documentation, something that you'll want to look at as you're using the API to understand how to formulate those requests and how to read the responses. Another couple of things that are really helpful are these self-referential links within vROps that help you with the next API call that you may make. For example, and this is called Helios, by the way. It's an abbreviation. Don't ask me what it stands for. I have to look it up every time. But all you have to know is when you send off a request to, for example, give me all virtual machines, that have this name, or have these characters in their name, you'll get a list of those virtual machines back. And part of the properties of each of those virtual machines will be these links, as you can see there on the slide. And those links will be some other API call that you might want to make next. For example, I want to get all the properties of this virtual machine. And so you'll see there's the third one down, Suite API resources, and then some long number, that's the resource ID, and then properties. So it saves you from having to look up the resource ID and put that into your URL. And it also saves you from having to go back to the documentation to figure out how to get properties from that virtual machine. So very time saving. The other thing is there's a project called Platypus. If you go to if you Google this or search for this on GitHub, you'll find Platypus is a Swagger-based representation of a lot of different APIs for different VMware products, but vROps is included in that as well. Some people find that this is a little easier to deal with. It does give you, a more formatted approach, gives you a better layout, easier to read maybe layout. But that's up to you. If you want to use that, you may want to take advantage of that and check that out as well. Two types of authorization are supported. One is basic authorization. That's just a simple username and auth source. And then there's a token-based authorization where you'll request a token and use that token for every subsequent API call that you make. This is actually a preferred way to do it. It's a little bit quicker. And as we talk about the best practices, that's one of the top things that I see, that when people have written scripts or code using the vROps API, a lot of times they're like, oh, it's slow, and they're making a lot of API calls and they're using basic authentication. Well, if you do that, what happens is it's doing a lookup of that user account every time. If you do the token based, you'll get the token once, it'll do that lookup once, and then from then on it'll just validate that token against a table, and then your response time is a lot quicker, especially when you have multiple calls. Another thing that you can do too is do single queries that return a lot of data and then parse that data in your code. That is also a lot quicker than making a lot of API calls. Sometimes we want the perfect API call that gives us exact information that we want from vROps. But the problem is that if I do that, I'm doing that for like every virtual machine I'm making this API call. It's better to get a lot of information about a bunch of virtual machines and then parse that in your code, because it's a lot quicker than making those external API calls. Today we're going to use the Postman client to demonstrate the API. I really recommend that you look into this. We're going to do 4 things here. We're going to authenticate via bearer token. We're going to find a virtual machine by resource name, and then we're going to get all the stat keys for that virtual machine that are have CPU in the name. So basically all the CPU metrics, and then we'll get the latest 30 minutes worth of stats for all those CPU, and I'll show you how you can get that in CSV or JSON or whatever format that you like. If you do use Postman, I recommend you use the QR code there or go to that link to get my Postman collection off of GitHub for vROps. I've got a lot of good examples in there, as you'll see when we go into the demo, so be sure to check that out. So let's jump into the demonstration. So as I mentioned, we're going to use Postman client to do play around with the REST API. in the demo today. So here I have the REST, the Postman client open, and I already have loaded in here my collection for vRealize operations. So this is the same thing that you can download from my GitHub site and import into your Postman installation. And you see I just have a lot of different REST API calls. They're not all the API calls that are available, but they're some of the more frequently used ones. So I have them in here. They're already examples and so forth to help you get started. One of the things that you will notice is that as I go through this, I'm using environment variables, and those come from environments that I have set up in Postman. So here's a vROps environment, for example, and I have the vROps instance IP address, the username, password, just some other variables in here. So you're going to want to set that up to be able to use my collection, because I reference those variables in all of these examples. And I'll show you what I mean as we walk through this. So the first thing that we're going to do, as I mentioned, was use the token method for authentication. So we're going to get a token, and the API method for that is right here. So it's a post, and then it's /API auth token acquire. Now you'll notice that I have right here, I have this in between two curly braces, I have that vROps keyword from my environment, or that value, key value pair. So that key vROps corresponds to this IP address, and what's going to happen is Postman will just fill in the IP address. So that means I could use multiple environments. I could have multiple environments set up in here. For example, here's a different environment, and I just changed the IP address in that environment to something else. I may have different passwords, etc. So it just allows you to use other environments as well. I just use it because it's a lot quicker than retyping in my credentials and my all the other information every time, and it has other utilities as you'll see as we go through this. So I have two headers set for this. I'm going to work with JSON in this, just my preference. The default is XML for the responses and any requests that you send, but I'm going to use JSON. And then the body of this contains the information that the request requires. So post requests usually have a body that contains some amount of information, and in this case it's username, password, so that you can authenticate to get the token. Now, how did I know that? Well, if you go and you look at the API documentation, and you go to the auth API, and we go to the acquire token method, you can see that this is where I found out it's post, and then here's the URL or URI that I would use for that. And then it also shows me an example in JSON and XML if I wanted to use XML, but in JSON format. So I can just take and cut and copy or copy and paste that into my Postman client body, and just fill in the values that I want for username and password, and I'm good to go. So I've got everything I needed from the documentation. Something else I did here, I have user and pass between those curly braces, and you'll notice that those correspond to two values in my environment. So this is so I don't have to update this every time I want to log into a different environment or something like that. I just switch to my new environment here, and off I go. And then finally, tests is a way to validate the information that you get back. This is a feature of the Postman client, and usually this is used for just checking to make sure you're getting the proper response. You can also use it to grab data out of the response and add it to your environment variables. So I'm actually going to grab the bearer token out of the response, and then we'll see where it gets added to my to my environment variables. So we're all ready. Let's go ahead and send that off. When we send it off, you'll see we get a response very quickly. Response code's right here. Status 200 is good. Gives us the time that elapsed and then here's my authorization token, and here's the expiration. That expiration is if I don't, I need to be actively using the token. If I'm not actively using it, it will expire after a certain period of time. So, you know, if this expires, you can just request a new token. It's not a big deal, but that's the expiration. And what happened is that little piece of JavaScript that I have here, this is JavaScript, actually grabbed that bearer token, and you can see that token matches with the one that was returned. So now I have that as a variable, and I can use it in my next call, which will be to get a virtual machine resource by name. So if I go here to my headers, I can see I have an authorization header because I need to log in. I need to confirm who I am, and I have rights to do stuff. And then that value that we saw in the slide earlier for a vRealize ops token, and then the token value. And so you can see again, I'm using that environment variable bearer token, and it automatically is going to put that in there for me. Again, another time saver. So in this case, the API call that I'm using is get and then API resources. You'll see this question mark here, which means I'm performing a query. And in that query, I'm looking for any resource kind, a virtual machine, and a name that is /11002. Now, how did I know that? So again, let's look at the documentation. Oops, didn't mean to close that out. If we look at, in our documentation, if we look at the resources, and where's that? Our get resources call, which I'm using, you can see all the different parameters that you can use in that REST call to just filter out and get exactly what it is that you want to do. So you can see here name, you can see here the resource kind, etc. So you'll also notice that you have the style column. Typically, you're either going to see query or template. If it's query, it means that it comes after the question mark when you've put this, after you've entered this path. You're going to put a question mark and then your query parameters, and then this will tell you whether or not you can have one or more instances, or whether or not it's required. And this will tell you whether or not you can have one or more instances of that. So I could search for multiple virtual machines. I could search for SLES 11001, 11002, etc. I would just have to put and name equal for each of those. And then, of course, what type is it? Is it string, integer, UUID, long, So all of these are ways that you can filter that query. If you just do get API resources, you're going to get every resource in the system. You get a long list. That may be what you want, but if you only want virtual machines, then you could do resource kind virtual machine. In my case, for this example, I want to get a particular virtual machine from the system, so I've also included that name equals /11002. So let's send that off. And here's my response. Again, status is 200, came back very quickly, and I can see that the total count, the number of matches that was returned is 1. And if I look down here, I can see there's my resource list, and here's that one resource. And I get all kind of great information about that. Here's the name field that was matched. Here's the resource kind key, virtual machine. Here's the resource ID of that machine, etc. Or actually, this is the resource ID in vROps, and badge scores, badge information, etc. So a lot of good information. But also I mentioned those self-referential links that Helios feature in the API, and this is really handy because now I want to go after, for example, the stat keys. Find all the stat keys, or I want to find all the latest stats of this resource. Now, normally I'd have to go out to the documentation, look up what that REST call is, and then I'd also have to cut and paste or copy and paste that resource ID from here into my REST call. What's neat is if I just click on this in Postman, it'll just open up another tab and automatically put that information in there for me. And then all I have to come in and do is just add my headers, and I'm actually using a preset here where I can just add those automatically, and then fire that off, and boom, there are all my stat keys. So easy way to kind of play around with this, roam around, look at what you want to do. Now, in my case, we want to grab a particular set of stat keys, and those stat keys that we want are for the CPU group. Now, I'm going to run the same API call with that vROps resource and resource ID. By the way, in this REST call, I had a test that grabs that resource ID and makes it an environment variable that I can use. Again, a handy thing if you've got groups, like I have this group, and I want to run this group together as a test in Postman, I can do that. I can run a test, and it'll run these one after the other and give me the results. So I don't have to, run one, copy the resource ID, paste it into the next call, and so forth. So there's a lot of point I'm trying to get across is a very powerful tool as you're exploring the API. So we're going to get the stat keys for that resource. Same API call that you saw me make just a few seconds ago, but in this case, my little script here, my little JavaScript is going to grab everything that's a CPU, a resource key that starts with CPU something. All right, and what it's going to do with that is it's going to populate an environment variable. So let's send that off, and we get all the metrics again. So we're getting everything, and then this JavaScript will evaluate the response and just pull out those keys for CPU. Let's see what happened here. So now we've got CPU stats, and it just builds out the part that I'll need for the query. Notice this and stat key equals CPU use summation and stat key. So I'm building out the requests that I'll use in the next call. Okay. And then finally, I want to get the latest CPU stats for the last 30 minutes in CSV format. Now, if I do this REST call, and you'll notice here I have that resource ID, and then here's the CPU stats request. When I make this REST call, what I'm going to get is, come on, sometimes it'll take a little while. What I'm going to get is one value for each of these. So here's CPU weight, and I got one value, one timestamp. By the way, this is a Unix timestamp. Okay, you'd have to convert it to human readable if you wanted to see what time it is. But the timestamp and one value. Why is that? Because we're using CPU stats latest, and by default, it's just going to return the last collection. If I want the last 30 minutes, how would I get that? Let's go look at the API documentation real quick. So if we're doing get latest stats of resource CSV, it's really this call, but you change the header to accept text/CSV. So instead of doing application JSON to get JSON back, I'm doing text CSV. So it gives it to me in CSV format. And then you'll notice that in the query, I have that resource ID and the stat key that I'm already using. I need to add one more thing here because my max samples is set, defaults to 1. If I want more than that, then I can use this as part of the query. So max samples, if we add that on to the end, so I'll do an and then, oops, that's not what I want. Max samples equals 6. Now, why am I doing 6 if I want the last 30 minutes? We know that vROps does 5-minute collections. It has 5-minute granularity. So if I want the last 30 minutes, then I'll do 6 samples. So I'll run that, and now my response, when it comes back, Here's my CPU weight, the first one that shows up, and then here are the 6 time frames. And if I were to take this and convert those into human readable, you'd see they're 5 minutes apart, and then each of the measurements for those time periods. So then I could take this response and I could use it in some other code or script or whatever to build a chart or evaluate it in some way. Or your dev team could use it to, see how their app is performing. A lot of different utilities there. Hopefully you get the point. Do take time to play around with this. Do take time to explore. Um, think about things that you do in the user interface that take longer to do than you'd like because you have to click through menus and so forth. One of the things that I do, or I used to do before we added properties to the all metrics tab, was it was a lot easier to come here and just make a REST call and look at the properties for a virtual machine, for example, or a host or something like that. It was a lot quicker to do it that way. So do those types of things, play around with it, and you'll learn it pretty quickly. You'll see how easy it is, and get a lot of value and use out of that. So let's go back to the presentation. All right, let's get started next with the PowerCli module for vROps. For those of you who are running PowerShell or PowerShell shops, you'll be happy to know that there is a module for vROps in PowerCli as of 6.0 or 2, so it's been around for quite some time now. And the commandlets that are provided are relatively basic. There's 12 commandlets out of the box. However, full API access is available, and we'll talk about that in a second. Here are the commandlets. Are mostly for read-only access, the exception being for the alerts. You can set alerts to take ownership or cancel alerts or suspend alerts and so forth. So you do have that option as well. Full API access, as I mentioned, we won't be able to demo this today. We just won't have time. But the full API access is available through extension data, and there is a global variable that is created when you make a connection to your vROps server, or OM server, as it's referred to in the module in PowerCli. You'll get the top level APIs. If you want, you can look at the like a resource that maybe you get using the commandlet to get a resource, OM resource. And if you get member on that or look at extension data on that rather, you'll see the APIs that pertain to that particular object. So it's a kind of a quick way to look at what's available versus looking at all the APIs that are available. You'll want to have the API documentation handy as you go through this. Because you'll still need to look at the API documentation and the data models if you're using the full API to help you kind of put together what's being asked for, what the parameters are all about. I actually have a blog series on this where I go through pretty much the same thing. The links are here. It's on our management, or it's on our VMware official VMware blog site. That last part 3 is the one that I'm not going to cover today, but I walk you through very explicitly how to use the full API with some examples there of injecting a property into a virtual machine. For example, using PowerShell. And all the examples that I'll use today and in these blog articles can be found on GitHub following that link. So if you want, you can download that. It's a PowerShell script, but it's just actually got all the commands that I'll use for the demonstration today. So speaking of the demonstration, let's jump right in and look at the PowerCli module for vROps. So obviously the first thing we want to do is connect to our OM server or ops server. It stands for Operations Management. And then the server will provide the IP. User will be admin, password, the good old standard. And if you're using a different source other than local to log in with, you can specify this for things like vCenter connection, or if you're using LDAP, Active Directory, and so forth. I'll just use my local admin account to log in.
And now I'm in. Maybe first thing I want to do is check alerts, see what alerts are out there. Now I want to filter this out because I don't want to look at every single alert that's ever been created in the system. So I'm going to do active alerts first and foremost. Then I'll set a criticality parameter for critical. And then we'll do everything under the health badge that fits that description. And then I'll do type. And here I'll put virtualization hypervisor alerts. Now, the type, I'll show you next how to get that, but most of these parameters map up to the columns that you'll see in the alerts page when you go into the UI. So you don't kind of have to puzzle out, what these mean or what these are if you're familiar with that, or if you're referencing that as you're playing around with this module. Then it'll be easy to associate those. Okay, great. So we got some alerts that came back, and that's fine. How did we get the type? How do we know what those are? So if we do the get OM alert type, that'll show us the types that are available that we can reference. And same thing for the subtype, which we'll use in the next example. There are all the subtypes, for application alerts, hypervisor alerts, and so forth. And generally, they're going to be availability, performance, capacity, compliance, and configuration are the ones that you're going to see there. So now you know where to find that information. We can dig a little bit deeper and look at things like alert definitions. And this is a way to list out the alert definitions that are available in the system. If you want to look up a particular alert by name, or you want to filter on name, but you're not sure what the name is, or you want to search for a particular name, you can do that using the alert definition subtype, get OM alert definition commandlet, and here I'll search for networking alerts of subtype configuration to get those listed out and see what's available. So here they are, and then I could just simply grab the name or partial name and do a search on that for using the get OM alert commandlet. And again, I'll do status active and name. Let's mix it up a little bit. I'm not going to use a networking one. I happen to know that virtual machine running out of disk space is a common one that I run into my environment. So I'll do virtual machine is running out of disk, and I can put an asterisk there so I don't have to put the whole definition in. I can just put a partial definition name for that. And if I hit return here, I should get a list of all the active alerts under that alert definition. And there we go. So that's great. I have all the active alerts for that particular condition, and I can start using this to maybe get some take some action through a script. Another thing that I can do is like get OM alert definitions. Oops, I don't want a variable there. Get OM alert definition. If I want to see all the definitions for a particular resource kind, in this case, I'll do virtual machine, so I can see those definitions. Oops, I think I need a capital V there. And here we go, showing just those that are pertain to a virtual machine. So I think you get the point on how to use this. Play around with it, kind of see what you can get and explore. But let's use this in more of a practical way. So I'm going to get one of the alerts, get OM alert for a particular resource, and that resource is a VM called li relay 01, and the impact is going to be health. Status is going to be active. So I'm getting all the active health alerts for that resource. Okay, let's see what that returned. Oh, just a single alert, and it's that one or more machines is running out of disk space. So let's do this in a more legible, readable way. So you can see the alert definition: one or more machine guest file systems is running out of disk space. So what would we do in that situation? Well, we may use PowerShell, for example. If this were a Windows server, I may use PowerShell to go in and actually delete some files off of the guest OS, or do some further investigation at that level. I could use vCenter. I could go into vCenter and basically expand the disk on that system, or add another disk to the system. So let's assume that maybe you wanted to first of all, you found this alert and you want to take ownership. You're going to do something with it. So let's take ownership by doing set OM alert, and the alert that we just captured, and we're going to use the take ownership parameter with the confirmation. And the take ownership doesn't take any input. It just uses the current logged in account user to take ownership. So if I now look at the alert, and I notice that the assigned user is now admin, where before it was well, it was admin. I think I had done that in a previous example, so I apologize for that. But that is how you take ownership. Now, another thing that I may want to do is, since I have ownership of this alert, I may want to suppress the alert to give me some time to work on it, so that nobody's breathing down my neck and saying, hey, did you know there's an alert on this system? So I can actually suspend the alert for a number of minutes, and I'll just suspend it for 60 minutes, give myself an hour to work on it, kind of figure out what's going on. I'm not canceling the alert, which I could do from here. I'm actually just suspending it so it gets it off of the board. The NOC doesn't see it while I'm working on it. So if we look at that now, we can see that we have suspended until time and date right there. So we know how long we have. We could always come back in and continue to suspend it or renew that suspension. Now I have an alert. What do I do? Well, we know that vROps gives recommendations. So one of the things I can do is get OM recommendation for that alert. And let's see what that looks like. Don't need a space there. Okay, and I see the description is add a new virtual hard disk or expand the disk of the virtual machine. First, remove all snapshots. So I got some tasks that I would normally go into vCenter to perform, but since I'm in PowerShell, PowerClient, maybe I just want to do them from here. So the nice thing is I can use this to actually get that VM information from ops and go connect to the vCenter server that manages that, and go ahead and start working on it from within my PowerShell client. So let's start doing that mapping. So I'm going to create a variable here called VM resource, and I'm going to make the alert resource I'm going to assign it the value for the alert resource. So if you look at this resource, that's at li relay. So it's just going to pump that into there. And now if I look at the VM resource extension data, and extension data is basically properties of some object that vROps is returning that don't have a corresponding PowerShell um, object or property, I should say. If you're ever looking for additional information, extension data is probably the way to go if it doesn't show up as on that first page of information that we see there with format list. So extension data, and then what I want to do is I want to get resource properties, and what I'm doing here is I'm actually making an API call through extension data that it's not directly available as a commandlet. There's no get OM resource properties, but I can use this API call through extension data, as I mentioned earlier, to get that information regardless. So I'm going to do where name like, and if I do parent here, what it'll return to me is all the parent objects for that virtual machine. So I have the cluster data center, etc. There's the vCenter. So I know which vCenter I need to connect to. So now I can do connect VI server, MSBU VC demo management.local, and log into that guy. And put my credentials here. I think I typed that correctly. Okay, so now I'm connected to the vCenter that manages my VM, and I can find that VM object by going get VM and then putting that VM resource variable that I created earlier. And if I do a VM FL, that's the vCenter VM, and now I have what I need to go ahead and start removing snapshots, maybe power the machine down, add the disk, power it back up, etc. All those things I could normally do. So another thing that we can do in here is we can get stats. So if I do OM stat key, just like we did earlier in the example using Postman, I'm using this to find all the CPU stat keys for my VM resource, which is that LI relay server we were looking at earlier. And if we look at that, it'll give us all the CPU metrics. Now, I just want one metric here for this example, so I'm going to say, well, stat key variable is going to be equal to get OM stat key. I don't know why they didn't look right. And then name is, we're going to do CPU workload. And then the resource is going to be that VM resource. Oops. Okay, so I have a stat key. Okay, and that has properties such as, the name, the unit, etc. So now I can use this to now get OM stat, and my resource will be my VM resource. The key will be that stat key. And then here I'm going to do a little date operation because the date that it's expecting is in Unix format. So I have a little chunk of script here that will allow me to put it in the proper format. And then I'll do add days minus 30 to give me the last 30 days of that. So interval type is days, and interval count 1, and then I want to average, so I'll do a roll up type average. Yep, fat fingered something there. We'll do it. Okay, and so there I have my CPU workload metrics averaged daily for the past 30 days. If I want to change that interval count, which is a multiplier, I can do 7, and it'll just take that and turn it into a daily average over a week, and then it'll give me the past 30 days worth of weeks. It actually comes out to be 5 weeks, but that is just some high-level stuff that you can do with the PowerShell. So let's go back to the slide and the presentation, and we'll talk about Webhook shims.
Okay, moving along, let's talk about Webhook shims. And webhook shims are a way that applications, or webhooks rather, not the shims, it's actually two parts as I'll explain. But webhooks are a way that applications can react to something happening in that application, go out and start another activity in a different application or a website or practically anything else. Think about, for example, if you have an alert in vROps, and you want that alert to generate a ticket in ServiceNow, or you want it to send a page in PagerDuty, or kick off a workflow in Orchestrator. All of these are possible with webhooks, and webhooks are enabled in vRealize operations through the REST notification plugin. So this basically is the engine that responds to alerts. You would set up a REST notification, have it tied to a particular alert condition, and then it would send a notification or a webhook out to a third-party system. However, as it says here on the slide, that payload is proprietary to vROps. So if you're sending information to ServiceNow, for example, ServiceNow has its own API that expects the request to be in a certain format to open an incident, for example, or create an incident. So how do we translate between ops, vROps, and ServiceNow, for example, or any of the products that you see here as an example? So that's where the shim piece of Webhook shims comes into place. The vROps proprietary payload is translated into the payload which is comprehensible by the third party or the destination API. And you can go and get this and download it from the link there at the bottom of the page. It's an open source project written by some people at VMware have contributed to this. You can contribute to it if you want. But it's just an example for connectivity between vROps and these other third-party systems. Now, in most cases, I personally would recommend, especially if you're running vRealize automation, for example, and you're already using Orchestrator for extensibility, using the shim that communicates, but that allows communication between vROps and Orchestrator. Because once you're in Orchestrator, you probably already have a set of plugins, or you do have a set of plugins and workflows that are already designed to work with third-party systems. And you can do multiple things at once. Instead of just opening a ticket, you can open a ticket, you can send a page,
and you can kick off a workflow to reboot a server or reconfigure a system in vSphere. So all those things are possible, and you can do it with rules and logic trees built around that particular response to the incident. So you can get more information at these links for Webhook shims. These are basically some blog articles to get you started walking through some of the stuff that I'll walk through today. Uh, if you're going to use Webhook shims, some things you may need to be familiar with or you'll want to kind of bone up on. It is written in Python 2.7. Of course, we covered REST APIs and how to use those. vRealize Orchestrator, if you're running vRealize automation, you're probably already familiar with this. And this is also the reason that I recommend JSON and JavaScript as two other skills, because that pairs very nicely with Orchestrator. By the way, this does work also with Log Insight. So Log Insight has a feature called Webhooks. And this solution will work with Log Insight or vROps without any modification. Okay, so you can use those together or concurrently with the same webhook shim solution. All right, let's jump into our demonstration and see how it works. Now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, you can grab this from GitHub, and this is the GitHub site for Webhook shims. But I want to show you a few things here in the repository that you'll just want to be aware of. First of all, there are three ways that you can install this, and I'll just start from the I guess the most difficult. I hate to use that word because it's really not even difficult, but and I'll go to the easier, and that's the one we'll actually use today. The manual install method just involves grabbing a Linux box. It could be anything. I'll use the Photon OS, VMware's own Linux distro, and you can just manually run these commands. Now, this assumes that you have Python installed, pip, virtual environments, Git. So there are some prerequisites that you have to meet here. Another option is to go ahead and just download the Photon OS specifically, and then all the commands are listed here for you to get started to install the things I just mentioned. So make sure that you have Python, pip, Git, everything that you need to run this, and then you'll run the commands to set it up. Still pretty easy, right? The last and easiest way to do this is just to run a Docker container that has already performed all these tasks for you, and this just downloads very quickly from Docker Hub, and you'll be able to get off and running in no time. And that's what I'll show you how to do today. Now, a couple of things to note. Once you get this, and however you install it, you'll need to actually go in and configure the shims that you want to use, and those are found in the Log Insight Webhook demo folder or directory. And as you look at the different shims, these are all just Python scripts. You can go in and edit those on your own deployment. And what you'll see is most of them have at the top, that's Socialcast. Let's go to actually ServiceNow. Most of them have up at the top some parameters that you need to fill out. So for example, for ServiceNow, we have the URL, user, and password. And then for Orchestrator, we have host name, user, and password. Same type of information. That's really all you need to configure on these to get started. So it's really easy to implement. Now I mentioned Docker. So out on the VMware Docker Hub, where there is a Webhook shims Docker image, and the instructions on how to pull it and run it are here, and these are the instructions that we'll follow. So if you ever get confused on what to do, you can just come and look here. You do need Docker installed. Docker can be installed on any Linux platform. Again, Photon would be something that I would recommend, but you can also run it on Windows. Windows 10 is supported by Docker as well. Okay, Let's set up our scenario here. So I have a virtual machine, and this virtual machine has the endpoint operations agent running on it, and it's actually monitoring a process. And that process is VM tools. So what I'm going to do to kind of kick this off is I'm going to uh, manually go in and stop the VM tools service as an example of something stopping or failing on a server. And what will happen is I have an alert defined that when this service is unavailable, we'll kick off an alert, and that alert will trigger the REST notification that we talked about earlier. So let's see what that looks like real quick. So if we go to the administration and then we go to the outbound settings, this is where you configure your REST notification plugin. As you can see here, I have two of them set up. The first one is for ServiceNow. We'll edit that. And basically what this points to is when I get my Webhook shim server installed, I'll use the IP address and port, and then I'll point to the ServiceNow shim by using endpoint service. If you think this looks a little like the REST API that we were working with before for vROps, this is essentially what we're doing. It's a little miniature REST API that we have running on this server, and this is the API call, if you will, to go out and open a ticket on ServiceNow. So you set that up. I have one also for Orchestrator, which will attempt to restart the service. So we'll do both of those actually. We'll restart the service. We'll attempt to restart the service, and we'll open a ticket with ServiceNow. Same thing, I have this endpoint VRO, and then I have this long number here. What is this? That number, or that ID, is the ID of the workflow that I wish to run in Orchestrator. And so that's passed along as part of that webhook, so that when this information finally gets to Orchestrator, Orchestrator knows which workflow to kick off. And so the shim will handle processing that for us. Now let's look quickly at the alert notification, because that's the second part of this. If I go to notifications, this is where I can invoke an alert notification for a specific alert against that against the adapter notification plugin instance that I set up previously. So I have restart service, and I'm going to use the REST notification plugin, and specifically the instance of Webhook shim test VRO. And then my scope is that service, that VM tools D. I'm being very, very specific here. You don't have to do this. I'm just doing it for testing purposes. And then the specific alert. And then I'm going to have it only fire off that notification if it's a new alert. And likewise, I've set up the same thing for opening a ticket in ServiceNow. Same conditions. So it'll perform both of those tasks. All right, now, so how do we set this up? So as I mentioned, we're going to install this on a Photon server that I have running in the environment, a Photon OS VM, and we'll just download. I've already actually downloaded the Docker image, so we'll go ahead and configure everything. And the way that you want to run this is just like I have documented on the Webhook shim Docker hub page. So it'll be Docker run IT, so we want it to be interactive. P for port, and we're going to map port 5001 on the host OS with 5001 in the container. And then we're going to give it a name so it's easy to manage this from Docker instead of getting a randomly generated name. And then we'll give the Docker Hub repository name. And then finally, I want this to start up in the bash shell so I can actually configure. So there we are, containers running. It's as simple as that. If you didn't have it already pulled down, it would go and pull it down and then start it. Very quick process. All you have to do at this point is edit the shims that you want to use. So I'm going to use the ServiceNow shim, And here I will put my ServiceNow URL as https dev 27575 service-now.com, and then my credentials admin and the good old hands-on lab default password. Okay, that all looks good. And I'm also going to use the orchestrator shim, so I'll do vRealize orchestrator.py. And for this, all we need to put is the IP address and the host, or the port rather, of our orchestrator server. So 10.140. Oh, I always forget this guy. 4513. I don't know why I can't commit that to memory. And then the port 8281. The default port's listed up here for you if you forget what that is. And then for the authentication, there's different authentication methods you can use. We're not going to use NetRC. All that's documented right up there directly in the code. We're going to use VCO admin, the local default account for orchestrator. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to turn this verify off because we're using self-signed certificates. Not something you want to do in production, but for our little lab environment, it should be okay. Done. We are configured. We are ready to use the Webhook shims. So we'll just start it up by typing python run server.py. That's how you start the server up. And you'll notice that the server is running on, it says 0000, but it's listening on all ports basically or on all addresses or interfaces at 5001. Now, if I go and actually stop, let's create our little condition here. So I'll log into my server that's being monitored in endpoint operations, and I'll do service VM tools, VMware tools stop the service. So there we go, that'll trigger that. And while we're waiting for that to happen, let's quickly go and look and see what happens if we just go right to that Webhook shim server that I just set up. And you'll notice you get this nice little documentation page. Think of this as like the API documentation, just like we were looking earlier at the vROps API documentation. It shows you all the endpoints and how to use them. Here's the VRO down here. Here's ServiceNow right here. And you'll notice that each of these has like a variation with alert ID and without alert ID. This is because LogInsight doesn't send the alert ID as part of the URI, where vROps does. So just indication that it can handle both types of use cases. There's even a test endpoint that you can use if you just want to test it out with, say, Postman and make sure everything's running and working. So that looks great. So while we're waiting here, let's watch Orchestrator, and let's watch the log information as we wait for that alert to fire in ops. It should trigger relatively quickly here. All right, so there we see some activity. It's getting fired off there. And so what we should expect to see is the ticket being opened. And we should see back here that our orchestrator workflow ran, and it did. So that service, first of all, should be restarted. Let's just check that. Service status. And it is. So if we look and check service now, and just refresh this, we have a ticket opened in ServiceNow with that. So Webhook shims in action. Hope you find that helpful. Let's return to the demo, or return to the presentation, wrap up. All right, so that concludes the session for today. Thank you very much for your attendance. We'll go into some questions now. My contact information is there on the screen if you want to reach out to me with any specific questions that you may be too shy to ask in a public forum. certainly glad to hear from you or your experiences as you try some of these things out. So let's open the line for questioning.